So Paul's response to all this idolatry is, man, this is, here I have a layover, anywhere from 5 days, because it was about a 4-day journey from Berea back down by ship, 2 weeks over land, so Paul's got some time to kill. Now, I was in the city of Norfolk just last week on business, and I had an afternoon to kill. So what did I do? I went down to the battlefield at Yorktown. I looked up some friends, had some dinner with some people that I had known from long ago. And what does Paul do? He goes to the Agora Marketplace, which is the picture down there on the lower right, which is where everybody would have come for food. There was no refrigerators, so it was fresh or nothing. And so everybody came on nearly a daily basis, the whole city, to buy their meal for the day. And so Paul goes to this marketplace and just reasons with the common man, because he's moved by the idolatry that he sees. And anybody who will give him an audience, he goes and talks to, right? So he encounters there just the average Joe. I don't know what Greek for Joe is, but he goes and he encounters these average people, and he speaks to them. He sees the philosophers of the day. There was really 2 leading schools of thought, and this is called out in particular, the Epicureans and the Stoics. Epicureanism has sort of been misrendered today, but back in that day, the Epicurean school taught that the greatest good was to seek modest pleasures, basically to limit the pleasures of your life, and balance that with knowledge in order to attain a state of tranquility. We've kind of replaced, when we hear talk about Epicureanism today, we're talking about hedonism, which is just a life solely devoted to fulfilling your own pleasures. The Epicureans were materialists who believed the world had always existed as it is, and our job was to balance our pleasures with our pains and basically keep a good balance in your life. The Stoics were similar. The Stoicism would take root later in Roman thought, and Stoicism would really become dominant. It's all through history kind of pinnacleized in the writings of Marcus Aurelius, which are still popular today, kind of a leading Stoic warrior of the Roman times. But the Stoics believed, you can sort of sum up the Stoicism if you've seen Spock. Right? Just emotions are destructive. If you're giving yourself over to that wild emotional side, that's going to lead to a ruinous nature, and really Spock kind of epitomizes what the Stoics were looking for. A balance and a control over your emotion while still maintaining a free will. So those are the things that were important to him. And these guys see Paul. You can jump to the next slide. So these guys see Paul, and they're kind of intrigued by the things that this guy has to say. And they say, what is this babbler in verse 18? What does this babbler want to say? I like this word here. The word babbler is really literally translated seed picker. Right? So these are the educated people, the pinnacle of the modern world, the Greek schools of thought, the philosophers that everybody was looking for, and they see this hayseed, this bumpkin, right? This guy from Tarsus who's out here. Now they don't understand, and Paul doesn't bring it up, they don't know that he has religious and academic credentials that are at least on par with the best educations that anybody in this city has, but he doesn't mention it, and he comes across as a hayseed. What's this country bumpkin, this crazy nut talking about? Which is kind of encouraging to me. I'll come back to that, being a country bumpkin myself. So they bring him, they're intrigued by this new thing that he's talking about, and they bring him in front of the Areopagus. Now this is this little altar here is one that's actually out of Roman times. And when Paul comes before the Areopagus, this is really the town council. The Areopagus serves the function of a council of elders, right? So these are the smartest, brightest political guys of the day, and they say, all right, come to our city leaders, and we want them to hear this strange thing that you have to say, because one, they're intrigued with hearing anything new, and two, Paul, he comes across as, even though he's a hayseed, a seed picker, a babbler, but he speaks with authority, and it's something, he's got something that they don't recognize or that they haven't seen before, and it's important enough to bring him to the town council. So what does Paul do? He stands up to the men of Athens, and he stands there at the Areopagus, which, by the way, you'll see translated as Mars Hill if you're reading the King James Version, because the Ares, it really means the mountain of the god of war, and it's just this hill that's in the middle of Athens. The Ares is the Greek name, Mars is the Latin name, so it comes across as Mars Hill in the King James Version. So he stands up and he says, men of Athens, I perceive that you, in all things, you are very religious, right? I've walked through your city, I've seen your altars. As I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I found an altar with the inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore, one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with your hands as though he needed anything. He's made from one blood every nation and men to dwell on the face of the earth, and he's determined the pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. So he talks in strong words about the omnipotence of God. Now this is a fabulous tool, and I want to point out to you, Paul has two MOs. When he goes to a city, he reasons first with the Jews, and how does he approach them? He opens the Old Testament, the common ground of the Word of God, and he reasons them out of the Old Testament and shows them that through the Old Testament, their books, the Torah, it points them to Christ, right? And that's his objective always, is to lead people to Christ. Well, he doesn't have that common ground here, and anytime he goes someplace where he's dealing with Gentiles or unchurched people, he starts in natural revelation, right? Look at this world. Look at what God has made. Isn't that a beautiful sunset that God has given us today? Look at that rainbow. God put that there, right? I believe that. Now, naturally you say, well, when white light strikes a round object in accordance with Snell's law, light is refracted and proportional to its wavelengths, and that's why you get this. Yes, science check, right? You're good, okay? But it does not alleviate the fact that that rainbow is placed there as a promise from God. That is a direct communication to me from God saying, I promise you that I will not destroy the world by flood, right? It's almost impossible, if you haven't noticed, to not look at a rainbow, right? It stops you. It stops you in your tracks no matter what you're doing, and you have to look, right? So that is a communication from God to us. And so natural revelation is a common ground that we have with people who, whether they're churched or unchurched, you can point to them and say, man, God gave us a beautiful sunset tonight, didn't he? And that can be an opening ground. And this is the way that Paul approaches unchurched persons. So God's handwriting is written with large letters across the grandeur of the universe. Try to wrap your mind around the billions and billions of stars that Carl Sagan's talked about. Try to wrap your mind around the distance to cross from one end to another. If I have to go distances that it takes light billions of years to travel, right? It's incomprehensible, the amount of space that's out there. Look at the images from the Hubble Space Telescope and all these other things. It's very moving to you. To me as well. Try to walk alone at night on a beach under the sunlight or under the starlight with nothing but quiet and the roar of the ocean and not recognize that we are children of God and that the world is made by him, right? That is the place where he will speak to you. And I think he speaks to all people, whether they're believers or not, and creates that longing. And Paul uses that. He taps into it. Go in the other direction from the macroscopic to the microscopic. You know, the incredible organized detail in the microscopic world. It's impossible for this stuff to have just happened by mistake, right? It takes over 27 separate individual biochemical steps for your blood to clot. Without any one of those steps, you bleed to death every time you get a cut, right? It's a miracle. There is no way that chemical process has evolved, right? You could not evolve a process that complex and make it work. No organism would ever live through the evolutionary process, right? So we as Christians have this great tool to recognize, right, that we believe that God made the world, period. It's simple, right? I don't need to go scientifically prove that. Paul doesn't go into some deep proof. He just states it straight out, right? God who made the world, bam, there it is, right? I believe that. It's simple. And it's a point of fact because you don't even need to debate the science, because when it comes down to it, the evolutionary scientists, those who believe in a gradual relativism and the creation of the world, they're not scientists either. No one has ever observed an animal change from a horse to a horse with wings, right? It's not observable. It's outside of science.